All right, so this is the second of what we think, but we're not promising anything, is our three-part series on Jeremiah 17, 9, and 10. The heart is deceptive more than anything else, and desperately sick. Who can know it? I, the Lord, search the heart. I test the mind, even to give every person according to his ways, according to the fruit of his doings. Very briefly then, this three-point summary of last time together. We were looking at two fundamental aspects of the heart. One of those aspects being perception. It is at the heart that we perceive reality as it really is, or we don't. But that is its purpose. The heart has this function of perception. And the heart is the seat of our core longing. The heart, we saw, reflects the person. And so that deep longing is actually the crying out of the true self. The third aspect, the heart is buried so deep under deception that we cannot perceive what is really going on, nor can we know our core longing or true personhood. And that is, we can't know that unaided. Okay? And that's the basic of what we were talking about last week. This week, we're going to continue on with the idea that the heart is desperately sick. And these words, desperately sick, can be translated weak, or frail, or feeble. The word can also be translated so damaged that it cannot recover on its own. So damaged that it cannot recover on its own. We would say today probably that the heart is in critical condition, life-threatening condition. And having said that, let's take a look at Ephesians 4, 17, 18, and then 22, and see what connections we can draw between what Paul is writing and this scripture from Jeremiah 17, 9, and 10. Paul writes, "Therefore, I say and testify on behalf of the Lord that you should no longer walk as the rest of the Gentiles also walk, in the futility of their perception. They are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Put away your former way of life that belongs to the old humanity and is wasting away through deceived desires." So let's begin with this. What points of connection do you see between this passage from Ephesians and Jeremiah 17:9?
Deception.
Deception is there, very strongly. Yes. Any others?
Well, desperately sick would go with wasting away.
Absolutely
and
right.
Alienated from the life of God would be going with who can know it, because you can't.
Correct. Correct. What do you see in verse 17, which would be the number one on your page that I have listed?
Their perceptions, you know.
Their perception. Remember I said last week that in the New Testament, the word that would go along with heart is the word nous, N-O-U-S. And it is this word perception. That's why I was making the connection there. So this futile perception is shown in their darkened understanding. And then as someone brought out, that the heart is sick. Number 2, where we see that most clearly is in verse 18. When Paul writes that the heart is hardened, he's saying that the heart is sick. And the connection may not be readily available to us, but if we think of a physical condition, the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy that somebody might have in heart disease, that means that the walls, the muscle of the heart, the walls have become so thick that it no longer has the function, it's too weak to pump blood. And that's called a hard heart. Your heart hardens because the muscles thicken. And the hardening of the heart is actually the loss of function. And so it's actually a condition in which the heart is weakened. And so that's the connection that we need to make when we look at a hard heart here. Not just that they're arrogant against God and so forth and so on, but that this is the sign of a weakened heart. If our spiritual heart is hard, that means that it's sick. And the function of longing is weakened. As Paul says, a hardened heart causes us to be ignorant, his own word, of our old person. Or ignorant of how desperately sick, I should say, we are. Of our longing. We're ignorant that what we really long for is life with God. And that's why there's this alienation going on. So let me try to redeem that, and if you're trying to take notes. As Paul says, a hardened heart causes us to be ignorant of our core longing for life with God, resulting in our alienation from Him.
Where is that?
That would be number 3 on what I'm doing.
I did not know we were doing development. Can you say that one last
Sure.
before you get?
Sure. Sorry, I've made that more difficult for you. I just kind of went ahead in my own mind,
you're
and
fine.
then
It made sense.
you all
I
didn't
looked
go
at
with
Mom,
me.
She was
I don't know
filling
why.
it out. I just didn't know.
So as I'll make the connection, we're still on number 2 now. As Paul says, a hardened heart causes us to be ignorant of our core longing for life with God, resulting in our alienation from Him. So we're ignorant of Him, and that's why we don't have life with Him. And the reason is because our heart is hardened. It's sick. We don't know our own longing. Does that make sense at that point? Okay, as we move into number 3, I'm going to draw the connection with verse 22, which says that the condition of our old humanity, or our old person, is that they're desperately sick. They're wasting away. Desperately sick, wasting away. And they're doing so because of the deception of sin. Does that help the flow and to make it a bit more? Which kind of begs the question. Paul begs the question, how does the deception of sin cause the heart to waste away so that it is critically ill? We need to be sure, especially because as moderns, we don't see this as an ontological reality. We see it just as a psychological reality. And so how is getting deceived, which seems a purely psychological reality, how does that impact the nature of our being? Those two things seem to be really separate. For example, my mind might be really off and I could imagine myself to be a llama. But that doesn't really affect my physiology at all. Right? So what is this connection that's going on? And so I want us to look for just a moment at something that I'm calling an onto relation. And the word onto there is referring to ontology, the being. And what I mean by that will become clear in just a moment. But let me give this preface first. We tend to see persons as insulated, self-sufficient, separate entities, like little atoms just all around, little cue balls on a table. And a relationship, normally as we think of it, is a subjective, psychological, ideological, emotional bridge or interaction that we establish with another detached being. What's that say?
Did you repeat it?
Mm-hmm. We tend to see persons as insulated, self-sufficient, separate entities. Like, again, pool balls on a table. Now, we come into contact with another. As we think about relationship, that contact is subjective. It's psychological. It's ideological. It's this kind of emotional bridge that we try and establish with another detached person. In this way of thinking, a relationship is more of an experience that we share with another person or a commitment that we make to them. But we would never say that the relationship is what gives us our being, or that the relationship is what constitutes us as persons. In our thinking, we would exist as ourselves independent of whether the other person was with us in relationship or not. If I didn't marry Jackie, I'd have married somebody. My relationship with her doesn't establish my being. It's just this kind of emotional connection that we have with one another. But it's not at the level of being. And that's how we tend to see relationships. That's wrong, by the by. But we're not going to get into that in terms of our human relationships. It most certainly is not our relationship with God. And yet that's exactly how we think of our relationship with God. Well, God's over there, I'm over here, and, my relationship with God is my commitment to Him. Or my relationship with God is my faith in Him. If I don't have that, I'll continue to exist as who I am. And now here's the fill-in-the-blank part on your handout. But our relation to God is not like this. Our relationship to God is an onto relation, not a psychological relation, not an emotional relation. It is an onto relation. And that simply means this: God's relationship with us establishes our being, sustains our being, and completes our being. God's relationship with us establishes our being, sustains our being, and completes our being. Further, God's relationship with us is what constitutes us as persons. You could not be a person unless God was in relation with you. We would not exist apart from our relationship to Him. Now already this causes problems in the normal way of thinking. Well, what about all those people that don't have a relationship with God? All right? We'll get there. Everyone has a relationship with God.
Yeah.
Whether they believe in Him or not. Otherwise, they wouldn't exist. Because the relationship that we have with God is the one that establishes our being. God is establishing our being in His relation to us as Creator, as God to us. God is the one who is establishing that we are persons, because He relates to us as the creator of our personhood and the sustainer of our personhood and as the completer of our personhood. We don't have our own little battery pack person. And how could it be otherwise? Because God's own being is persons in loving communion. Right? There is no Father without the Son. There is no Son without the Father. There is neither Father and Son without the Spirit. God exists as a communion of persons. And so notice the terminology that is used. God is Father not because He's male. God is Father because that is both a person and a relation. That's my Father, but that's also a relationship, isn't it? Because you can't be a father unless there's a child. A father only exists in relation. Without the relation, there is no father. A son is the same thing. The Son is the person of the Son, but that is also a relation. There is no Son without the Father. There is no Father without the Son. And the Spirit is the one in whom there is this unity of person and relation. He's person too. And we are made in His image. So, of course, to be a person is going to require being in relation to Him. Whatever other person is there. That's what personhood is. And what other being is there except God? God is the source of being. So that means we are not insulated, self-sufficient, separate entities in relation to God. We depend upon God not only for our being, get this, but for our well-being. Because of God's relation to us, we are the kind of beings who thrive and flourish in loving communion with Him. If something corrupts that loving communion or its development, we experience a loss of that well-being. That damages us. Not just as a psychological reality, it damages our being. All right, before we move on, questions, comments?
I think it's like funny in society and culture generally. It's like I need that other person to complete me as that whole.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
It's a common narrative. I mean, it's like I'm not complete without this. They bring meaning to my life, and I've been guilty of that myself to great detriment.
Yes.
Thinking that the answer that I sought in all of creation was in another person versus the one who actually brought forth me into creation. So.
Right. The inclination to find that in another person is right. It's just the wrong person. We need the person that actually establishes our personhood and sustains it. Yeah. Any other comments, questions? So what's the problem of an unbeliever if they're in relation to God already?
They're trying to fulfill things that they don't even know what they're trying to satisfy, and they don't even really know what their heart longs for.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It's
Yes.
the same problem we have, just to a different grade.
Yes.
Right? They don't
Exactly.
see who they are truly and who God is to them truly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Perception is darkened.
Yes.
Yes. Were you going to say something this?
You said it, when that's damaged or not fully developed, then our well-being is
Yes.
present. So they have being, but it's not well.
Yes. Exactly right. In the same way, if we're thinking physically, if you do have hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, then that damage keeps you from well-being. You can't run around, throw a softball. Sorry, it's my own private thing. Because your being is affected. We need to see that this is the same way for our hearts. This is not just a psychological reality. It is the way we are constructed. Our relationship to God is a being constituting relation. And so everybody is in relation to God, they just don't all have a good relation with God. Does that make sense? So given what we have just said, what would be the effect of damaging our relationship to God? We've already answered this to some degree.
More sick and damaged.
Yes. Yes. We become more sick and damaged. Now,
Our deepest longing isn't as clear to us.
one more time.
Our deepest longing isn't as clear to us.
No, it isn't. The lack of that clarity has some real consequences. Again, you're absolutely right, but we need to see this as more, once again, than simply a psychological or an emotional thing. It will touch that because we are the kinds of beings that have psychologies and emotions. But it takes being that kind of being to have psychology and emotion. We don't have those independent of our being as humans. It's because we are humans that we have that kind of psychology and emotion. And we've got to see that those things are affected because our being is affected. And so our heart is sick because deception keeps us from sharing in life-giving communion with God. The communion that we are intended to live in with God is what provides our well-being. We are created from communion for communion, and if we lack communion, we lack well-being. And this is why even our physicality has to be drawn into the communion of God. That's what the resurrection is about. There is nothing that exists as an independent in creation. Nothing. Everything is connected in creation. Everything is relational, which is another way to say the same thing, in creation. And we're used to thinking there are all kinds of, not just distinctions. Distinction exists within unity, as we were talking about at home church. But this self-sufficient, isolated property of something, there simply is no such thing. Because the God who created all things, the Word, right, who brings all things into being, is speaking of who God is in all things. Not as isolated individual things, but through all things into this reality that communion is the ground of being. And so, of course, everything is going to be a participant in that communion. The way that we know that in the physical world is obviously going to have to be different than what God is in himself, but it is meant to be a means through which God teaches us that everything is related and that communion is the nature of being. And so creation itself is going to have to be a display of that.
It's like the atoms I showed you, the pictures they took this morning.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So there has to be this.
Would you say then the way we think, the individual isolated is a condition of our sick and damaged heart?
Yes.
And
Yes. That's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
All right, very quickly, let's take a look at Mark 2:15-17. Now it happened, as Jesus was dining in Levi's house, that many tax collectors and sinners also sat together with Jesus and his disciples. For there were many, and they followed him. And when the scribes and Pharisees saw him eating with the tax collectors and sinners, they said to his disciples, "How is it that he eats and drinks with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard it, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." So this question that follows, in verse 17, how does Jesus describe the sinners he's been eating with?
Sick and healing.
They're sick. They are sick. They're not evil, wicked. They're sick. Remembering the meaning of table fellowship, and for those of you who don't, eating together, eating a meal together at table, for the Jewish culture was a way of sharing in one another's life. It was a means of deeply opening yourself to another, and they're opening themselves to you. It was a very important thing. It's a whole lot different than just meeting at McDonald's. There was a lot of significance in that. So remembering the meaning of table fellowship in Jesus' day, what is the significance of Jesus sharing with sinners at the dinner table?
Wow, he was providing an opportunity for them to know him and him to listen to them.
Yes.
Sharing the relationship back to him.
Yes. Yes. Jesus, remember, always you have to remember this. Whenever you think of Jesus, you have to first say, oh, what is Jesus again? Always. Always. Jesus is humanity in communion with God. Jesus is our humanity shaped entirely by communion with God. So by sharing himself with them, he is bringing life-giving communion to those who are in critical need, to those whose hearts are sick. And he is bringing himself, who is communion, humanity in communion with God, to those who need it for their well-being.
And them having supper together is a picture of Jesus doing that with humanity. Wow.
Exactly
That's
right.
awesome.
Exactly right. And this is what Jesus wants to do with us. This is why a relationship with Jesus is not just about doing the right thing. Relationship with Jesus is about becoming well. It's about coming to discover who you are as a person. It's about coming to discover the deep longing of your heart that nothing can satisfy but Him. It is about moving from simply being into well-being. And from there we move into eternal being. Okay. So what does it mean to you to think that the heart is critically ill?
It's sick.
It's sick.
It's lacking life.
It's lacking life. Right. It's on life support almost, you know. It's not bad. It's not evil. And that means that your personhood isn't evil, because that's the core of who you are. Your core isn't bad. But it is wasting away. It'll never waste entirely away, because why? God's related to it, and God is supplying being. So you'll never just waste away to nothing, because God is in relation to you, and God holds you in being. But I want you to think also, this is why you feel so weak sometimes to do the right thing. This is why you want to do things, but you don't have the strength to accomplish it. I want to be good, in quotes, in this relationship. But every time that comes up, I just don't find the strength to be that. Now that's a reality, and we'll address more on that topic next week. But how often that weakness is used against us to say, you just need to try harder. You're just lazy, and you may be lazy. I mean, there is such a thing. But have you ever noticed how hard it is, if you're lazy, not to be lazy? It's because there's something that is broken, or we would say something diseased. You're weakened in your longing. And so not only can your longing not perceive what is true, your longing doesn't seem to have the strength to inform your will to choose what you really long for. And that's why, further, this isn't just a choice you make. Well, just make the right choice. Just depressed, just choose not to be. Anxious, just choose not to be. Holy moly. And how condemning is it if you are depressed, if you are anxious, and someone tells you, well, just snap out of it.
Yeah.
Just stop it.
Right. And then you try and work
Who was the
something
comedian
out.
that did that?
You want to smack them.
That was
Bob Newhart.
Bob Newhart. Yeah.
Bob Newhart. He was a psychologist. And he
But
said,
that is the-
stop it.
That is the ultimate
Just
goal.
stop it.
The ultimate goal is to change perspective. I've tried to tell myself that too.
Yeah.
Like, it's nearly impossible, but that's the name of the game.
But notice, self-control is a gift of the Spirit. It isn't something you work up.
Right.
But we don't think that way. We're not taught to think that way. We're taught to think entirely different from that. Right? And so, our own sin has weakened us, but not only our own sin. We've been sinned against. And the sinning against has also damaged us, damaged our hearts, weakened us, ruined us. And so my plea here is that we see not only ourselves but other people for the reality of our life situations. They're not just pure evil. Their sin and how they have been sinned against has weakened their hearts. They can't perceive things the way that you do. You can't pour perception into another person's head. This is where evangelicalism went completely wrong. If we can just develop all the right philosophical answers, then we'll simply convert people by giving them the right answer, as though that ever worked. We'll out-argue them. And if I can out-argue you, then I'll argue you into loving God with everything you've got.
No.
When did that ever happen? I may not be able to beat your argument, but that doesn't mean I love God. But that's how we've been raised. And so we think the main thing is to amass this kind of theological vigor that I can simply give the right answers and out-argue anybody else. And there's no life in that.
No.
There's no life in that. It's not to say that right answers don't count, but they are not the source of life. And perception is an act of revelation. Now it helps if somebody's speaking something to you that would line up with what wants to be revealed. I'm not saying that isn't helpful. I'm just saying that the answer alone isn't the issue. And it never will be. That's why Job can say, he goes into that whirlwind, right? God, he has all of these questions, Job does. God goes into this big confrontation with him. And he says, so, you want to know? And he says, well, where were you? And he does all this stuff. And he shows him the marvelous mystery of creation and doesn't answer anything that Job has asked. But Job says, I don't have any more questions. Because the meeting was the meaning. Not all the philosophy and the right theology that they threw. Right? It's not to say that right theology is important. Of course it is. So if this is the way reality is, then shouldn't we look at ourselves and just have a little more kindness to ourselves?
Yeah.
Shouldn't we have just a little more understanding and kindness to the people who are around us? And can we stop thinking that God doesn't know how to be as kind as we are? That somehow or another God looks at this reality we're just now talking about, and he's still just so, he's so angry with us. He so wants us to pay for everything. And he just can't get past that justice stuff. Can't we just leave that aside? Can't God be at least as kind as we can be? And that's what we'll get into next week when we deal with God knows your heart. Any closing comments or questions? All right. In just a few moments, we're going to be celebrating the communion that we have with God in Jesus Christ, the well-being that God wants to give us in Jesus, the nourishment. Reflect on that for just a minute, and then come and take from the bread and the cup.